A Chinese semiconductor equipment company you have probably never heard of just climbed into the global top 5 by sales revenue, a leaderboard that has been owned by the same American, Japanese, and Dutch firms for 30 years. That should not have been possible. The conventional wisdom said China's toolmakers were permanently locked a lap behind, structurally dependent on Western know-how for everything that mattered at the frontier. And yet, by most industry counts, Naura Technology Group sits at roughly number 5 globally by semiconductor equipment revenue. At least 2 other Chinese equipment makers have joined it inside the global top 20. A leaderboard that looked fixed for 3 decades has new names on it. Before you take that as a story about China catching up across the board, it isn't. The rank is real. What sits behind it is more complicated and more important than the headline suggests. Semiconductor equipment is the layer above the chips themselves, the machines that make the machines. Every wafer that becomes a processor, a memory chip, or a sensor passes through dozens of specialized tools before it becomes anything useful. Whoever controls those tools sets the rules for every fab on Earth. If that control is shifting, even partially, the ripple touches every product built on silicon, every data center, every device in your pocket. The stakes are not abstract. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how China's toolmakers reach these positions, what kind of progress that ranking actually represents, and where the real gap still holds, and why knowing the difference matters more than the headline number. Because this is not really a story about one company hitting number 5. It is a story about whether closing the rank gap and closing the capability gap are the same race. They are not. And the answer to that shapes everything about what happens next in chips. There is something about the product mix behind Naura's ranking that nobody is talking about loudly enough. We will get to that. There is something that changed the demand picture sharply and recently, accelerating the climb in ways that were not predicted. We will get to that too. And there is a set of process steps, the hardest turns in the manufacturing sequence, that the revenue leaderboard says nothing about. And those are the ones that actually determine who builds tomorrow's most capable chips. To understand why this ranking matters, you need to understand why it was not supposed to happen. Semiconductor equipment is not one thing. It is a stack of highly specialized categories, each requiring its own distinct machine, and each machine representing decades of accumulated process knowledge. The core categories include chemical vapor deposition and physical vapor deposition, which deposit thin films onto wafers. Etch tools, which carve those films into precise patterns. Clean and strip tools, which remove residue between steps. Furnace and diffusion equipment, which control heat treatments. Chemical mechanical planarization, which polishes surfaces flat. Lithography, which projects circuit patterns using light. And inspection and metrology, which measure whether everything worked to tolerances measured in atoms. Think of a modern fab as a building that needs dozens of specialized tradespeople to function. You can get very good at drywall. That does not mean you can wire the high voltage panel. The incumbents, Applied Materials, Lam Research, Tokyo Electron, ASML, KLA, own the high voltage panel steps. The ones where a mistake does not just reduce yield, it makes the chip impossible. China has gotten very good at drywall, and drywall matters enormously. A building without it is not a building, but the two skills are not interchangeable, and one does not automatically lead to the other. The reason the hierarchy froze for 30 years is not mainly legal or political. The barrier is epistemic and reputational. Process integration knowledge is cumulative. It builds up through thousands of cycles of developing a tool alongside the fabs using it, watching where yields collapse, fixing the recipe, iterating again. TSMC, Intel, and Samsung have co-developed process recipes with the major equipment incumbents over decades. That accumulated knowledge is not purchasable, and leading fabs will not risk their yields on unproven tools. The switching cost is measured not in dollars, but in wafers lost and quarters delayed, so the hierarchy held. Until something changed the demand picture. What changed was a procurement shock, and it ran in both directions. Starting around 2019 and accelerating sharply after export control actions in 2022, China's access to certain foreign tools was restricted. The United States Bureau of Industry and Security added rules that cut off advanced equipment, advanced chip technology, and the people who work on them from Chinese fabs. The Netherlands followed with export controls restricting ASML's ability to ship both its most advanced extreme ultraviolet machines and its older deep ultraviolet systems to China. The effect was a sharp and sudden incentive to buy domestically whatever domestic suppliers could deliver. And China's domestic fab build-out, SMIC, C, XMT, YMTC, and others expanding capacity aggressively, was already generating enormous procurement demand. That demand now flowed preferentially to Naura and its peers. Naura's core product lines, based on its public company filings, are chemical vapor deposition, physical vapor deposition, atomic layer deposition, etch tools, oxidation and diffusion furnaces, and clean equipment. These are the categories every fab needs in large quantities. A single modern fab requires not dozens, but hundreds of deposition and etch tools running continuously. Sell enough of them to enough rapidly expanding domestic fabs, and the revenue accumulates fast. That arithmetic is how you climb a global ranking without necessarily advancing into the most technically demanding process steps. If every runner on the track suddenly has to buy their shoes from domestic suppliers, the domestic shoemaker's revenue jumps, even if the shoes are not yet the ones elite sprinters wear for the final 100 meters. That is not a criticism of the shoemaker. It is an explanation of what the revenue number actually measures. The objection that comes up immediately is fair. Is this just China buying from itself and calling it competitive progress? Partly yes. But the tools have to work. Chinese fabs are producing real chips on Naura equipment. That is process validation at scale, not procurement theater. The honest question is which process nodes and which steps. And that is where the story turns. Because not all process steps cost the same, and not all of them are equal in what they enable. In a leading-edge logic manufacturing flow, the lithography step gets most of the attention and a substantial portion of the budget. But deposition and etch steps together run through the flow far more often. A multi-patterning approach at an advanced node requires multiple deposition and etch cycles for every single lithography pass. At mature nodes, 28 nanometers and above, the ratio of deposition and etch tool hours to lithography hours is even more favorable to volume. Mature node fabs are where the bulk of China's domestic chip output sits, consistent with public reporting and SMIC's own disclosures. And mature node fabs need many deposition and etch tools. That is the arithmetic of why Naura's revenue rank reached approximately number 5 without requiring leadership at the frontier. Think of it like a restaurant kitchen. Most of the labor and most of the equipment spend goes into prep work, cooking stations, and cleaning. The single most critical piece, the one that determines whether the most technically demanding dish is achievable, is a specialized oven that costs more than everything else combined and takes years to master. Naura is selling excellent prep equipment to a lot of kitchens. The specialized oven is still imported, or, in the case of the most advanced lithography, it is not available at all. Revenue rank does not require leading-edge capability. That is the trap. And it is the trap that the most important analysts, investors, and policymakers are currently falling into when they read the leaderboard movement as evidence of capability convergence. Here is the break that the ranking obscures. Naura's revenue mix, based on the company reporting and analyst characterization, is weighted toward chemical vapor deposition, physical vapor deposition, atomic layer deposition, etch tools for mature nodes, thermal processing, and clean. Not toward the leading-edge etch tools needed for sub-5-nanometer patterning, not toward advanced inspection and metrology at the resolutions required for frontier logic, and certainly not toward lithography of any kind. The incumbents' dominance in those steps is not a close call. Leading-edge etch at the most advanced nodes, where the tolerances are measured in fractions of atoms and a single process excursion destroys the wafer, is dominated by Lam Research and Tokyo Electron. Advanced inspection and metrology, where KLA's tools catch defects that would otherwise slip through and destroy yield at the end of a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing sequence, is KLA's domain. And extreme ultraviolet lithography, the technology that makes sub-7-nanometer logic possible, is an effective monopoly held by ASML, reinforced by export controls that prevent China from obtaining either the machines or the most advanced older alternatives. Naura has stated ambitions in more advanced tool categories. Where such statements exist, they are company targets, stated goals, not established production capability. The gap between trailing-edge competence and leading-edge process integration is not primarily a capital gap. Revenue can help close a capital gap. The incumbent's advantage is a process knowledge gap, accumulated across decades of co-development with the world's most demanding customers. That kind of gap takes years of qualification cycles to close, and the customers who could accelerate the closing, TSMC, Samsung, Intel, are not buying Naura's leading-edge tools at scale. Can Naura develop the harder tools now that it has the revenue? Revenue helps, but the barrier is not mainly money. You cannot buy 30 years of process co-development. China's toolmakers are working on it, but they are starting that climb from a different base, and the incumbents are not standing still. So here is what the revenue leaderboard is actually showing you. There are two races happening simultaneously, measured on the same scoreboard, which is exactly how the confusion happens. Race 1 is the revenue rank 66 styles, who sells the most tools. China is genuinely closing that gap faster than almost anyone predicted 5 years ago. The pack has closed on the leaders in the positions that were closable. By industry estimates, Naura sits at roughly number 5 globally. At least 2 other Chinese equipment makers are inside the top 20. That is a real structural shift in a hierarchy that was supposed to be frozen. Race 2 is process capability at the frontier, who can make the tools that enable the next node, the next generation of compute, the next memory architecture. That race is still dominated by the incumbents. The lead there has not compressed at the same rate as the revenue rank. The strategic consequence of that asymmetry is what matters and is almost never stated clearly. China has raised its floor. A domestic fab ecosystem built substantially on Naura deposition and etch tools is less exposed to a sudden cutoff in trailing edge tooling than it was in 2019. If supply chains tighten further, if access to foreign tools narrows again, China's mature node fabs have more domestic alternatives than they did 5 years ago. That is not nothing. Automotive chips, industrial controllers, analog components, radio frequency devices, sensors, the massive and growing market served by mature node production can increasingly be manufactured with a more domestically resilient tool set. That is a genuine strategic achievement, but the ceiling is still set by others. The ability to produce frontier logic, the chips that run the most capable artificial intelligence workloads, the processors at the heart of next-generation data center infrastructure, the most capable consumer devices. Those chips require extreme ultraviolet lithography, advanced multi-patterning etch, leading-edge inspection, and process integration that China cannot yet build into a complete domestic stack. China's access to extreme ultraviolet machines is blocked by Dutch export controls. Advanced logic production at the frontier, outside of TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, remains limited globally, and none of those three are building on a China domestic tool stack at the frontier. The pack has closed on the leaders in the middle sections of the race. But the hardest turns, the technical sections that separate the field at the limit, are still ahead. And the leaders built their advantage exactly there, in the steps that cannot be replicated by volume in deposition and etch. Here is my honest read. The dismissive take. This ranking is just China buying from itself and calling it progress. Misses that real tools are enabling real production at real scale, and that a domestic equipment floor capable of surviving a trailing edge supply shock is a genuine strategic fact, not a projection. The triumphalist takes China has broken Western dominance in semiconductor equipment is not what the product mix shows. What the evidence actually shows is a floor rising faster than the incumbents wanted, while the ceiling question remains genuinely open. Naura at roughly number 5 means the domestic fab ecosystem has more resilience than it did. It does not mean the frontier is within reach on a domestic tool stack. Those are different claims, and conflating them is the single most important analytical mistake being made about China's equipment sector right now. The rank split has compressed to a couple of positions. The capability split at the frontier has not moved at the same pace. Both of those things are true simultaneously. and that asymmetry is the actual picture. Here is what I genuinely want your read on. The floor China has built is already real. Domestic tooling capable enough to sustain its mature node fabs through a trailing edge supply cutoff is a fact, not a forecast. The ceiling, whether China can reach the process steps that define frontier compute, is still genuinely open, and the answer to that question will take years to resolve. Which one matters more to you right now? The floor that has already been raised, or the ceiling that is still being held? I want your honest answer in the comments, and I want to know why you weight it the way you do. If you want to follow exactly how this capability gap moves, or does not, over the next year, as Naura's product mix either stays trailing edge or starts winning qualifications at harder nodes, and as the export control environment keeps shifting, subscribe. That specific question is what this channel tracks. A year ago, the pack was not even on the same leaderboard. Now, it is a couple of positions back, in the middle of the race. The hardest turns are still coming, and the distance to those turns is the only number that actually determines who wins.